Hey everyone, welcome to our online edition of Public Assistance Programs. This is Matt DiCarlo. Let's hope this goes well. I am going to start off just like we do every class by reviewing the course calendar. I guess you guys can't really ask any questions, and as I talked about in the email, any discussions will happen online via the D2L discussion board. You guys don't have to stay inside of your groups. You can comment on whoever's critical questions or journal entries that you guys would like to do. And we'll resume our normal in-person discussions next week. So let's take a look at the course calendar and see what's coming up. So like I said, today we are working on public assistance programs. We are working on the American healthcare system as well as mental health and substance abuse policy next week. You guys also have critical questions and journal entries. And then the week after that, we will be going over criminal justice and child welfare policies. You guys also mentioned on the 14th that you all wanted to have a little bit more instruction on how to create and draft up your final paper. We will definitely be doing that as well. And here's just a quick look of things that are happening after that. So one of the things that I wanted to pick up on from last week, it was an idea that I hadn't really thought about, so I wanted to comment on it a bit, which is why do we even need Social Security? Why can't we just put money way inside of a bank account and we'll all be fine? Well, unfortunately, the price of goods goes up over time. So you guys probably noticed this. A dollar doesn't really go as far as it used to. The prices for just about everything just tend to go up a little bit. And that's called commodity price inflation. So your purchasing power over time declines. I have a video linked here, which I won't make you watch inside of this video, although I do suggest it. It was published by PBS. The second kind of inflation is also that the value of money itself declines over time. That's a phenomenon called monetary inflation. And this goes into the role of the Federal Reserve in setting financial policy for the country. The Federal Reserve sets about a 2% annual inflation value for money. And the goal with that is to create full employment and more progressive conditions in the overall economy. Whether it does that or not is kind of an open question, but that is what we have been doing essentially since the 30s when the Fed finally took over the monetary system. So here are some assumptions about how the public assistance system or the social welfare system actually gives out benefits. So most people believe that the benefits are rather generous. In fact, I've read multiple studies that are false about how people on welfare are actually rational to stay on it because it pays much more than a job would. Welfare recipients are also seen to have not as much internal motivation, especially motivation to work, but also just general life motivation. People on welfare are a stigmatized population, so people tend to have a lot of negative assumptions about their character, about their morals, about their behavior. People also believe that work is the best anti-poverty program, and this is a view that is shared across the ideological spectrum. So you can sort of see, as we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, the centrality of work towards anti-poverty relief. We also believe that stigma helps prevent dependency, we as a culture, that by viewing people who take public assistance and public assistance itself as something that is bad or shameful, that less people are likely to do it, and therefore they're more likely to rely on friends or family or even the faith community or other kinds of dependency or work that will help lift them out of poverty. And then a final assumption, and one that really came up with welfare reform, was that mothers of children shouldn't receive assistance unless they're working, and that children are better off, therefore, when they are not raised by those mothers, but are in fact better off when they are raised by mothers who work and they are raised inside of a childcare type of environment. So a lot of myths about people in public assistance programs. Your book goes through them pretty well. I've updated some of the myth busting statistics that they use inside of the chapter in the next couple of slides. But it's important to note that these myths are widely held inside of our society. Part of our job here is to sort of educate you as social workers who advocate for this population. You guys need to be aware of the counter arguments because these things come up pretty much all the time. So TANF doesn't pay very much. TANF, especially in states, as you can see in the geographic south, with some exceptions across the country, don't pay much at all. And so this is a chart from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities about what states, how much TANF benefits will actually pay a person versus the poverty line. So the darker states like New York and California, Alaska, Connecticut, those states are that person is going to be paid closer to the federal poverty level. Though you can notice that in states like California and New York, where the cost of living may be much higher, those benefits may not go as further or as far. Unfortunately, TANF benefits have declined in value over time. So unlike SSIs we'll go over, TANF benefits are not chained to inflation. So as we talked about before, those values which may either go up under more generous administrations or stay the same or get reduced in other administrations, regardless of the actual cash value, those are going to buy less and less goods over time. In fact, only 3 states have had their grant values increased, so the amount of benefits that they could be giving to individuals almost uniformly across the United States has gone down. So one of these sort of things that people don't really understand about TANF is that TANF monies can be spent for a wide variety of things. So only about a quarter of it actually goes to the beneficiaries themselves in the form of cash. And that is what most people think of when they are talking about welfare. They're talking about benefits that are put on an EBT card that people can use to buy goods and services or withdrawn for cash. A lot of the services and supports that are provided via TANF are things that we generally like pre-K and child welfare, tax credits to individuals, which we went over inside of tax policy, and also childcare. But you can see there's a growing portion of the TANF budget that is being used for things that aren't really even that related to TANF. TANF funds, as your book explains, can be used to fund other programs, other mandatory spending. So that is taking money away from TANF recipients and putting it towards, let's say, Medicaid beneficiaries, which, I mean, I'm not against funding more for Medicaid beneficiaries, but taking money from TANF to do that can really disadvantage this population since they don't really make very much to begin with. So as you can see, after welfare reform, the amount of people in poverty who were on AFDC or TANF really declined. So TANF is reaching only 23% of people who in families with children who are in poverty, whereas that number in 1979 was 82%. So AFDC had a much better reach in terms of getting to the populations that are really experiencing poverty. Whereas apparently most people either don't know about TANF or have good reasons why they can't qualify for TANF or just think that it's not worth the effort for the amount of benefits that they're going to get. And you can see I've highlighted where Virginia is on here because people usually like to see where their home state is from. So we have few poor families with children received TANF. That's the number of families with children receiving TANF benefits for every 100 families. So again, TANF is reaching fewer and fewer families and fewer jobless single mothers as well. In as much as TANF is a work program, this is a really big problem and a challenge for TANF. And a lot of times when people are defending TANF, they will say that, well, you just look at what happened in the late 90s, where caseloads went down, never married mothers really entered in the job workforce. Unfortunately, those numbers are really due to larger economic forces. As your book sort of talks about, the late 90s were a rather large boom time in our economy. And during that era of prosperity, there generally were jobs. But after the dot-com bubble burst, and then after the housing bubble burst as well, you can see that the employment prospects for that population have dipped back down. And one of the main critiques of TANF is that it increases child poverty. And unfortunately, I don't have a snappy graphic for this, but that it increases deep poverty. So people with TANF or people who advocate for TANF will often say that um, TANF will help people who are want to get work or who are better able to get back into the job market. So what happens to people who have really significant barriers to entering the job market, who maybe have trauma or a mental health issue or very low education? Those people tend to stay in really deep poverty, and they also tend to be the people that TANF can't help because it's not designed to. And what happens is that child poverty overall um, goes up. So let's talk a little bit about the history of TANF. This stuff is not from your text, but TANF itself, the idea of just giving money to people in poverty, is not new. A lot of times this was done through mutual aid societies around the turn of the last century. So Catholic societies, labor organizations, if you guys know civil society organizations like the Woodsmen or Moose Lodges, those sorts of things. And there's a difference between outdoor relief, which is sort of things like poorhouses, orphanages, mental hospitals, schools for the deaf. That is generally seen as okay. Uh, Sorry, that's indoor relief. Whereas outdoor relief, direct cash benefits, people living inside of their own home, paying them because they're in poverty, is seen as encouraging people to be lazy and dependent. And the impetus behind these larger programs in AFDC and what eventually became TANF was that these private systems during the Great Depression were really overwhelmed, and poverty and poor conditions couldn't really be handled inside of the private sector. So the New Deal era brought the idea of mother's pension. So again, the idea that sexism is sort of baked into our public assistance system. Um, so women who were widowed or whose husbands were disabled, those people were eligible for pensions, first on the state level and then finally on the federal level. And it's based on the traditional model of a family where the mother is at home, the father's the breadwinner because the father's the person who can be employed. When that person dies, what happens to that family? That was sort of the social problem that public assistance was originally meant to solve. So the New Deal authors weren't necessarily benevolent. They thought that cash assistance tend to erode character and thought of the program really as temporary and specifically for deserving mothers only. Another sort of important piece of historical fact here is the idea of man in the house rules. So you guys missed a really interesting time to be a social worker when part of your job would have been to make sure people were not having sex with other men who were, in this case, substitute fathers. I'm not going to read all of this. You guys can read it on the slides. But this is quoting from the decision to take down or to outlaw the man of the house rules, which said that if a woman was in a relationship with another man and was sexually active with that man, then that man would have been responsible for supporting her kids rather than the state. And that was eventually overturned in the 1960s.